It just occurred to me maybe today, we always start with just some kind of brief either contemplation, I'll call it, before we get into the text of the Uttara Tantra. And so now we're on the section of the text that talks about Buddha nature, right? The potential for Buddhahood that's pure, that always remains pure. That's never even right. Even when one has mental afflictions, they can't damage, right? We last class we talked about some metaphors, right? Like water, right? That if a pond has dirt stirred up, it does, then it can look quite murky, but then the dirt will settle and the water remains water, right? Undefiled. Or a jewel, right? It was a metaphor of a jewel that even if a jewel is kind of thrown under a pile of dirt or is buried, buried under dirt, it remains a jewel, uh, totally undefiled. So just thought we can contemplate for a moment, right? To actually try to relate that first to ourselves. So to actually sort of contemplate for a moment, right? Because the ultimate nature of my mind is in the nature of what they're calling sometimes purity, also or emptiness. Therefore, I can develop good qualities, and the mind can be purified of even the subtlest negativities. So to actually try to feel, right? Wow, I can become Buddha. I can become a fully enlightened being. Whatever, like the worst of my own past, anything if you think back, right, the worst mistakes I've ever made, the worst mental afflictions I've ever felt, are not in the nature of my mind. They're temporary, they're adventitious, right? They just arose due to some causes, temporary causes and conditions. But the nature of my mind remained and remains Buddha nature. My own deepest nature is this, is the seed of one thus come to Tathagata. So that is my deepest nature. That's always been my deepest nature. So we're just trying to contemplate on that first for ourselves, right? So all the suffering I experience, all the confusion, all the different, craving or anger or ignorance or pride or jealousy and so on, are all like temporary clouds in the nature of, which pass through, but the sky remains, space remains in the nature of space. So like that, right? All those mental afflictions, all those problems, all those confusions, all the suffering are like temporary passing clouds. It's just not yet recognized, the space-like nature of my mind, but it's there. That's in my nature to become a Buddha, a fully awakened being. And just take another moment, right? Just to contemplate. That's my nature. Each of us is contemplating. That's my potential. That's my capacity. A capacity for limitless wisdom, limitless bliss, limitless love, limitless compassion. And that's true not only of myself, but we can think, just take a moment now, think about like the whoever you think of, so whoever each of us thinks of as like particularly obscured, right? Particularly caught up, overwhelmed by ignorance, confusion, hatred, so on. So you can take a moment to think of people who you ordinarily think of as extremely, uh, using my metaphor from earlier, like a cloud, like extremely cloudy sky. Um, and then we contemplate, though that person or those people, their deepest nature is also purity, clarity, emptiness. They also have the capacity for Buddhahood. It's temporarily obscured. But their temporary obscuration, just like mine at my worst moments, right, is just adventitious, right? Just due to causes and conditions, the mental afflictions have proliferated. But those mental afflictions are not in the deepest nature of their mind, not in the deepest nature of their being. They also have Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha. You say like, so the seed or the embryo of a Tathagata is also there in them. And just let's take a moment to try to feel that. And if you think actually of somebody like whose face and voice are contorted in rage or hatred or and then you feel, but underneath that, behind, like that's a temporary, like a cloud that's formed, right? A temporary manifestation due to causes and conditions. But their deeper nature is the potential to be a Buddha. Right? Then we can cultivate, or we may start to feel, I want to liberate beings from those temporary obscurations, myself and others. It's totally unbearable, actually, right? That beings whose deepest nature is the capacity for liberation, for love, for compassion, for limitless wisdom, due to temporary causes and conditions, are caught up in mental afflictions. And just all that's needed is the right causes and conditions, and those mental afflictions which arose due to causes and conditions can cease. But the ultimate nature of mind never ceases. We think like that, then we start to feel, I must liberate myself and others from the mental afflictions. Like I need to lift the jewel out of the mud and wash it off. The jewel-like nature of my own mind, firstly, right? And then to help others. So with that kind of recognition, then we can develop bodhicitta, right? The wish to realize the nature of our own mind, which purifies the adventitious or temporary flaws or obscure things that obscure it, but that never touched its essence, which remained in the nature of purity, total purity. One feel, one cultivates a feeling, right, of bodhicitta, like I must realize nature of my own mind, my Buddha nature. To liberate myself from those adventitious suffering and causes of suffering, and particularly in order to then help others who are suffering horrifically just because they don't see, they haven't come to see the deepest their own deepest nature. And with that, hearts or minds, we can do, which I'll just do once the verse, right? Of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of generosity and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Then we'll return to the text. Oh, actually, though, did we? I think at the end last time, John, did we kind of left off? Did you still have something you wanted to add? We ran out of time at the end, and John, I'm not sure if you wanted to start by asking something or raising something.
Yeah, I'd like to do that if that's okay. But,
Sure, go ahead.
Actually, I'm kind of glad that it was delayed for a week because I've had more time to think about it as well and look back on the text. But this began for me when I read those 4 causes for purifying the defilements, devotion to Mahayana,
Hmm?
and then bringing up, exalted wisdom, followed by, that high level of concentration in shamatha, and then compassion. And I wondered about the order of those. And as you pointed out very well last week, of course, in context, it's with regard to addressing, those 4 dispositions of different people, beginning with those who are just totally absorbed in samsara, couldn't care less about any spiritual tradition, and then on into the, the non-Buddhist, and then into the hearers and the self-made Buddhists. And of course, that makes perfect sense. That's in context. I'm sure that's what Gyaltsab Je was getting at. But be that as it may, my mind was off on this tangent, and I referred back to an earlier part in Gyaltsab Je's commentary. If anybody wants to look at it, it's on pages 26 and 27. And there he's bringing up this distinction between sharp faculty students versus dull faculty students, and pointing out that the Uttara Tantra is intended for sharp faculty disciples, wherein they initially develop an advanced understanding of emptiness. So really concentrating on vipassana. And then on the basis of that, because they've understood that very clearly, they can thereby develop that sense of universal responsibility for all beings, because they understand from that advanced understanding of wisdom, how they actually go about achieving Buddhahood, not only how to do it, but that it's possible. And I don't know, that really struck me because I just, for many, many years, as I've studied the Lam Rim, sometimes I was, well, I wouldn't say annoyed, but kind of questioning the order of certain realizations, even when it comes down to the three principal realizations, and sometimes it seemed like to me that the order of those should be mixed up a bit. At least for me, it made more sense. So anyway, that's what I took from that. And again, both from Gyaltsab Je's introduction to the text, mentioning sharp faculty students, and then going into, I've actually seen that more than once where he seems to be hinting at that. And whether I'm the only one seeing that, because I'm on a particular path, I'm not sure. But anyway, that struck me as very interesting. So that was one thing. And if I could take just a minute more, another thing that has struck me as I continue to read the commentary is this whole notion of conceptual thought versus absorbed non-conceptual thought, for example, in the path of seeing. And again, throughout the years, I've thought about that a lot with regard to what distinguishes those. And one passage, Gyaltsab Je mentions this a number of times, but he uses this term that's translated as improper attention. And so I thought about that a lot. And tell me what you think about this. I mean, to me, what he's getting at when he mentions improper attention is conceptual thought imputing a self-nature to the perceptions. And so from the get-go, by improper attention, we get off on the wrong path with regard to understanding how things exist. And, so just, I mean, this is one reason I love this kind of commentary so much, is that it just gets at these kind of subtle misunderstandings that are going on, rooting out those kind of innate predispositions that we have to misperceive things. So just calling it improper attention, what that actually means, it just really helped me a lot. So do you think that's on the right track to understand improper attention to mean that we're just following that instinctive predisposition to impute a self-nature to any of our perceptions?
Should I jump in there? Or?
I'm sorry.
So is that the question, that part about the improper attention?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You think I'm understanding that correctly the way Gyaltsab Je is putting it? I think this also comes on further on in the commentary, so it may be premature to bring it up, but at this point I've done at least 1.5 readings of the commentary, to be continued. And each time I'm finding that as I read the commentary that I'm putting a lot of question marks in the margin, things that I'm not really getting. And then as I go back and read it again, sometimes I'm able to erase those question marks and then move ahead. But anyway, that's one of the things that jumped out at me, as well as another point that he brought up, which I won't go into detail on because again, it's maybe premature, but what he means when he brings up uninterrupted path. And I've been looking into that a bit and want to continue studying that just with regard to what he actually means. It would help if I had an understanding of Sanskrit, which I don't, Sanskrit or Tibetan, but sometimes I'm wondering what's actually being translated. So I've been looking at the Berzin archives, for example, to try to get some guidance out of that. But
I'll say a few points related to what you raised, and then we can I don't know, hopefully see if that's helpful. Change my view. Gallery there. Go through a few different points. Like one is in terms of sharp faculty and dull faculty, I'll say a quick comment about that. Sometimes they say in terms of generating bodhicitta that as you said, that less sharply facultied bodhisattvas, generate great compassion and universal responsibility before they realize emptiness. And usually the method that's used in that context is the 7-point cause and effect method for generating bodhicitta. So that's why in the Lamrim, in most Lamrim texts, some there are exceptions later, but in a lot of the Lamrim texts, that's the main method taught, and which is why it's in that order in part, is that it's taught before the realization of emptiness, and that's why there's an emphasis on the 7-point cause and effect method, viewing all beings as your mother and recollecting their kindness and so on. Whereas sharp faculty bodhisattvas, as you said, realize emptiness first and then realize bodhicitta. And usually they say that the method that's used in that context is equalizing and exchanging self for others, which is why that method's, for example, emphasized in certain texts by Nagarjuna, because he teaches sharp faculty bodhisattvas who have a capacity to understand emptiness first. And so that's one point, I guess, just to note is that, and then we can combine those two methods also. It's okay, but to help ourselves, but that's true. So and this text is for sharp faculty. The main audience would be sharp faculty and bodhisattvas, I think is correct. Then about your point about sometimes they call it, it's interesting. I'd have to look through the text myself because you mentioned improper attention, and then there's also
improper mental attention. Yeah.
Mental attention. Okay, yeah, because sometimes they call it improper mentation. There are different translators who translate that different ways. Mental attention, though. One issue, I guess I'll just say, I'll make a comment on that. It's not like an answer exactly, but a comment is that because part of what happens, is that things, when we're not actually using your term, when either if we've not seen emptiness directly, then it's all the time, or if somebody has seen emptiness directly, then it's when they're not in the uninterrupted path, using that phrase you mentioned earlier. Then if you're not a Buddha, things appear to you as though they were intrinsically existent, right? That doesn't happen for Buddhas, but for anybody who's not a Buddha, even bodhisattvas, when they're not on an uninterrupted path and ordinary people all the time, things appear to us as if they were intrinsically existent or self-existent or independently existent. And until you're a Buddha, you can't actually, unless you're in a meditative equipoise, you can't stop that. So like when you're practicing generosity, for example, things appear to you that way. So the question that arises in terms of is what do you do, right? Like, so when things appear to us ordinarily as if they were intrinsically existent, what does one do in relation to those appearances, right? And sometimes we talk about what's it called, self-grasping, right? The self-grasping of persons and self-graspings of phenomena. And that's where what's the word? You grasp at things as though they actually exist in that incorrect way. So there's an appearance of things that's a false appearance. And then that, what's the word? Assenting to or grasping at or sort of holding on to that kind of appearance would be improper mental attention, right? Whereas there are different other things one can do. One can refute that false appearance, or one can, those who have realized emptiness have an increased capacity. One is to recognize that false appearance and challenge it. Another is to differentiate that false appearance from the merely labeled object that does exist. So really, I think improper mental attention is related to self-grasping, so to this assenting to and grasping at and holding on to that false appearance of things as if they were intrinsically existent or self-existent. But we can go into that more when we get to those parts of the text. I think it's a good idea. But I just want to at least mention that's there's a connection there, that's what that is to some extent. And so we have to be able to differentiate, right? Sometimes Lama Tsongkhapa talks about 3 different types of appearances. There's things appear, there's the appearance, what's the word? Seeing things as though they were intrinsically existent, seeing things as merely labeled, and a kind of seeing things that doesn't differentiate, that sort of doesn't make that differentiation. And part of what Lama Tsongkhapa points out is that for ordinary beings, it's oftentimes we're not able to differentiate those 3, or in general, we're not able to differentiate them. Whereas those who've seen emptiness are, again, an increased capacity for differentiating those different appearances, and those who've seen emptiness directly can do it quite well. So that's part. Anyway, so we can go into it more, but I want to at least say that much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Just briefly, one other thought that occurred to me when you were going over that contemplation is that, with regard to, the motivation to help other beings to free them of their defilements, of course, we have the 7-point cause and effect, which had a big impact on me when I studied that. And I continue to think that, that when we develop that sense of intimacy with all beings, that's very powerful. But the more I've thought about what we're studying here, when you see, come to a intellectual and then kind of a visceral understanding of Buddha nature existing within the mind stream of every being, that seems to me to be the most very powerful, way to develop that impetus, to reach Buddhahood, because you see that it's possible, and thereby, under the motivation to help other beings. So I just really love this text so much. I think it's just incredible.
Oh, me too. Yeah, as well. Great. Well, then I'll jump back to the text a bit, and then we'll have more questions hopefully too. But so I guess we were on the section that talks about 10 presentations, right? So we remember going back for a second. There are 7. The whole text of the Uttara Tantra has they call 7 Vajra topics, right? The first 3 were the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel. We covered that section of the text, and now we're on the longest part of chapter 1, which is the 4th Vajra topic, which is Tathagata essence, Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature. And there was a little introductory, couple of verses, and now there are going to be 10 presentations, and there's going to be a section on a bunch of similes for Buddha nature, which are quite meaningful. But right now we're covering the 10 presentations, which are like 10 aspects or 10 things about Buddha nature. And so we went through last time nature. And I'm not going to cover it again in detail, but in brief, the nature of Buddha nature is that it's, it says here, always unafflicted, right? Like a jewel, like space, or like water. So there is, and like those things, it can be covered over by mental afflictions, as I said in the contemplation, but it can never be. Its nature is always pure. And then we covered the cause. The next of the 10 presentations was cause. And these are going to come back up, so I'll just remind us, right, that cause was getting at there are 4 things that block people from realizing their Buddha nature, and then there are antidotes. Those 4 obstacles have antidotes, right? So John sort of mentioned this, but one is one obstacle is essentially not having an interest in practice or the path, right? And just sort of being caught up in as they call it, desire, just like those who, actually it's most, I joked last time, the first obstacle is most people you've ever met, including most likely yourself a lot of the time, right? Which is, you don't care, essentially. You just want to, actually it's how, I don't know, it's probably what you were taught is normal, right? Like, so in other words, try to get ahead, or try to get pleasure, try to get power, try to get status, try to get wealth, try to get whatever, try to get something, not enlightenment. So that's the first obstacle, which means you're not going to realize your Buddha nature if you're not interested in it, right? And the obstacle to that was, and the antidote to that obstacle was faith, right? Or devotion or conviction in the Dharma. Then that was the first one. The second obstacle was here. And for those who are following in the main text, it's on page 6 where it talks about cause, right? But the next one is grasping at a self. The next obstacle is grasping at a self of persons or phenomena, right? And that can mean having a philosophical system that grasps a certain kind of idea of self or Atman or soul or something like that. Or it could just mean grasping at a self the way ordinary people do, or the way some Buddhists do. In the text, Gyaltsab gets into a point about that, where he says there are Buddhist schools that still grasp at a kind of self. But anyway, whatever version of grasping at a self you have, that's an obstacle to realizing emptiness. So that's an obstacle to realizing your Buddha nature. And the antidote to that obstacle is transcendental wisdom, right? Realizing emptiness. Then the next obstacle to realizing your Buddha nature is fear, essentially. Right? And in particular, what they talk about, what the text, what various commentaries talk about, is this getting at like the fear that hearers, right? People who are seeking their own liberation. So there is like those who are on the path. This is the way somebody who's on a path is trying to achieve liberation, is trying to become free from samsara. They've understood the nature of samsara as suffering. They've understood that nirvana is peace. They're striving for nirvana, and they want to achieve nirvana, but they have but they're afraid of helping others or fully engaging with helping others, right? Because they're afraid of the suffering nature of samsara. And the text says the antidote to that is concentration, or samadhi. It says here in the translator here says samadhi, which is the Sanskrit word. We translate that as concentration. And that those kind of beings it talks about need the safe womb of samadhi in order to develop, kind of beautiful metaphor. That the state of concentration is like a protected state from suffering that allows one to do inner development. So we need meditative concentration. And then the last obstacle is a lack of compassion for others, right? So there is, because compassion is part of path to enlightenment, an essential part of it, and it's also an essential part of uncovering our Buddha nature. And the metaphor, the point they make is this is like the solitary realizers, the Prajeka Buddhas, who do realize emptiness, do have certain degree of compassion, but don't have great compassion. They don't have the kind of compassion that motivates them to remain working for others. And the antidote to that one is meditation on compassion itself, developing our compassion. So, we got through those points. And so the point here, though, just briefly, so remind us, because then that'll transition to the next step is, so when you start to read this text and think, wow, okay, maybe I do have Buddha nature, right? I mean, these points they're mainly then for oneself, if that makes sense. Like, in other words, so what are my obstacles to uncovering my Buddha nature? And we have to be honest with ourselves. So we look at those and we start to say, wow, so I have a capacity for infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, infinite creativity, infinite bliss. What's blocking me from realizing that? And at a certain point you might say, well, it's a lack of interest. It's that moment to moment, but just yesterday I was talking to a dear friend and we were having a conversation kind of like about this. And getting at was he was saying, well, I do my practice. He's a Dharma practitioner. He does a lot of practice, and he said, but that's not what, he was giving an example. He said that, but then when I have a dream, it's not about my practice. It's about some issue, problem, or something. And then what we were getting is, well, which are you more invested in? Which do you have more emotional reality with? Which do you have? Which is your core energy for life? And he said, oh yeah, it's the samsaric stuff. It's not, I put energy into the practice, but my energy is about, oh, but so and so said this, or oh, I'm going to see that this happened with this person. That's where my real energy is. And so of course that's what's affecting your mind then, right? Was what we were sort of talking about. So it's like, where's your energy? That's the faith in the Mahayana. It's your core in your practice. Then the compassion, right? Is it superficial or is it deep compassion that's compelling, that's visceral, that's fills the mind, that fills your being. So these 4 points are not for somebody else, they're for ourselves, is my point, right? So there's when they say there are 4 types of beings who have 4 types of obstacles, that's true in the world, but the main point for practice is which one am I? What's my obstacle now? And how do I overcome it? And this is telling you, meditate on faith, meditate on compassion, develop your samadhi. If you're feeling some dualistic sense of, well, I'd like to help others, but it's too hard, which we can have nowadays, right? You look around the world and there's so much misery, so much horror, that it's easy to feel discouraged, right? And so what's this text saying? Well, that's an obstacle to your practice, right? So you need to develop your concentration, develop your samadhi, and then you can engage more effectively with others, is the idea, because otherwise, what's the word? We have the capacity in the sense of the potential. We have Buddha nature. But these are the things that get in the way of us actualizing that potential and using it to help others. So anyway, that's the point, is that those four obstacles and 4 antidotes to the obstacles are for us to apply to ourselves as we practice along the path of trying to realize our own Buddha nature, say it that way. Then the next point, this is the main one, next 2 for today, there are 10 presentations. So the next 2 are result and function. So the result of Buddha nature and the function of Buddha nature. And so the line if you're looking at the text, you don't need to be, but it says, I'm just going to read a line here that says about result. It says, the perfection of qualities of purity, self, bliss, and permanence is the result. And then it elaborates more on that result. But I wanted to this is like an important point, and I think a really interesting one. So I hope we can kind of go into a little detail, right? So it says purity, self, bliss, and permanence. And to understand what the author, here, Maitreya, is doing, those 4 terms are connected ordinarily to people. I don't know, are people familiar? Well, first of all, I bet are all of you familiar with the 4 Noble Truths? And then how many of you are familiar with the 16 aspects of the 4 Noble Truths? Familiar with that? Maybe not.
No.
Oh, okay, good to know. So so the Buddha, the very first teaching of the Buddha in Deer Park, right, in near Sarnath, was the 4 Noble Truths, right? The truth of suffering, truth of the cause of suffering, truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering, right? So people are familiar with that. And then in those same texts, the Buddha teaches 4 aspects of each of those 4 Noble Truths. So he kind of elaborates on each one in 4 aspects. And so now we get into what's interesting about here is that the 4 aspects that the Buddha taught, and these are in the Pali Sutras and also the Sanskrit Sutras, but when the Buddha taught on the truth of suffering, he elaborated 4 aspects of that truth. And those were the same words that are mentioned here: purity, self, bliss, and permanence. He taught these points. So in the context of the vehicle of individual liberation, those terms had a certain meaning. And what that was getting at is this, is when we, ordinary people, right, when they look at impermanent things, for example, they grasp at them as though they're permanent. We all do that, right? Like just recently, I got a call from an old friend I went to college with my age, I got a friend, and found that he's dying. And my first reaction was, oh wow, right? Because I have a concept of permanence, right? I grasp it as if it's like, why am I saying, oh wow, of course, like everybody's going to die and it can happen any moment. But I was surprised a little bit, and that's because I tend to grasp at permanence, right? So point is that why do people suffer? But it was teaching about the Four Noble Truths, right? The truth of suffering. One aspect of why people suffer is, although things are impermanent, we grasp at them as though they were more permanent than they are. Right? Actually, we grasp more permanent than they are. They're not permanent at all. They don't last a second, right? They don't last a second moment, we say, actually, in Buddhism. Impermanence doesn't just mean things change over time in the long run, like they die. Impermanence means things change instant by instant, actually, right? And we don't see things that way. So where it says permanence, it means that part of the nature of the truth of suffering, part of what the Buddha was explaining, is we grasp at things as though they were permanent when actually they're changing instant by instant. Then where it says bliss, right? Bliss means we grasp at things as though they were blissful, even though they cause us suffering, and that we misunderstand that. And that's partly why we are subject to the truth of suffering, right? Is that, and it's like, I mean, they're all different, like, ways in which people do that, right? Well, I mean, actually, that idea, right? We grasp it as though it were bliss. It's actually kind of funny, isn't it? It's actually easy to see that in other people, like if you look at somebody, like if you look at somebody else who's like, say, you could say, oh, this person's addicted to this, right? And you look at it and you go, oh, look at that. They're doing that and it's going to cause them suffering, yet they're still grasping at it as if it was going to make them happy. What Buddha is saying is we all do that, right? So what do you do that in relation to? It's like, it's easy to see it. It's easy to see it in somebody else who's grasping at something you don't grasp at, as if it were the cause of bliss. Then you look at them and you say, oh, how sad. They're grasping at that as though it'll make them happy, but it's really going to cause them suffering, right? But people do that in relation to, for example, like what, it could be drugs or it could be a partner, right? Oh, this person's going to make me happy, right? But that person's in the nature of suffering. They're suffering themselves. They can't make you happy, right? They don't even know how to make themselves happy. You could grasp it in relation to a home or a job or wealth or there are infinite things, reputation. All those things are in the nature of suffering, yet we grasp at them as though they were the cause of bliss, and therefore we suffer. Right? So that's the bliss one. Purity, that we grasp at things as though they were wonderful. We say, oh, it's beautiful, or it's wonderful, or it's, when actually what the Buddha was saying is, that which is under the influence of mental afflictions is not pure, right? So anything under the influence of mental afflictions is impure in the sense that it causes suffering, right? And we don't see that, right? So we think, oh, it's wonderful. So when you grasp at something as though it were pure, when it's impure, meaning that it gives rise to your own mental afflictions, then that's how you suffer. And then the other one is self, right? We grasp at a self where there is no self, and therefore we suffer. So what the Buddha ordinarily explained, right, or not ordinarily, but in the first teaching, Buddha, and the first teachings of the Buddha, the first turning of the wheel, we call it. The first turning, this text, the Uttara Tantra, is from the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, which emphasizes Buddha nature, actually. But in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha taught these four aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Here in this text, what's interesting, right, is it's using this. Now let's look back at that phrasing. You'll hear it a different way, I hope. It says, the perfection of the qualities of purity, self, bliss, and permanence is the result. So here, the author, Maitreya, is taking these four terms that ordinarily are used to refer to the causes of suffering, and he's saying the perfection of them is the result. Right? So what does that mean? The perfection, like these things are ordinarily cause suffering. How can the perfection then be the result? And if we look a little bit below, it says, I'll read the verse because then I'll explain it. It says, in summary, the result of the four causes mentioned earlier, right? So the four causes were faith in the Mahayana, wisdom, concentration, and compassion, which are good things, right? Wonderful things. So the result of those four causes, distinguished by the four antidotes, right? Those overcome those four obstacles to uncovering your Buddha nature. Oppose for the fourfold misconceptions regarding the Dharmakaya. Then he says the Dharmakaya is pure by nature and has abandoned the adventitious defilements as well as the imprints. It is the perfection of purity. It is the highest self, having pacified elaborations of self and selflessness. It is the perfection of bliss, of having reversed the aggregates of a mental nature and their causes. It is the perfection of permanence, as it realizes samsara and nirvana to be of equal nature. So what Maitreya is doing here is he's taking the four terms, right, that in the context of samsara are four, we usually call them four delusions or four mistaken notions, right? Because those four are four mistaken notions in reference to samsara, samsaric things. And Maitreya is saying, in relation to the Dharmakaya, those four things are not mistaken. They actually are the nature of the Dharmakaya. So I want to go over it now again because I think it's subtle and it's helpful for practice in my experience. So ordinarily, I gotta say it one more time. Ordinarily, purity means seeing the impure as pure, right? Self means grasping at a self where no self exists. Bliss means grasping at suffering and its causes as though they were blissful, right? And permanence means viewing impermanent things as permanent. So in samsara, we grasp at those four things, but they aren't found in samsara. And Gyaltsabje, in his commentary, says you have to understand the object of perception here, right? So that when you're looking at something like a samsaric phenomena, and samsaric phenomena mean our own body, our own mind, and the bodies and minds of others around us who are in samsara. Samsara is not a place, like you wouldn't say, oh, that town is samsara. That town could be in samsara, but it's only in samsara because beings who are samsaric are there, right? Beings who have mental afflictions and their imprints. So we look at our own body or at the body of others, for example, and we grasp, or our own mind and the minds of others too, and we grasp at them in those ways. And Gyaltsabje makes a point. He says, recognizing that the impermanent is impermanent is a valid cognition. That's valid, right? Recognizing that there's no self where one grasps at a self is a valid cognition. Understanding that suffering is suffering is a valid cognition. So Maitreya is not, I want to be clear, because Gyaltsabje makes a very clear point about this in his commentary. Gyaltsabje is pointing out, so Maitreya is not saying ignore your valid cognitions. In other words, when you recognize suffering as suffering, that's true. This isn't contradicting that. When you recognize things are impermanent, they are impermanent. This is not contradicting that. Those are, if you contemplate the teachings of the Buddha and you realize those things, you're realizing something true, and that's good. And we're not going to reverse that and somehow say, oh no, that the samsaric phenomena are permanent. No, they're not permanent. So in other words, that was correct. Those are correct perceptions regarding those phenomena. But these 4 points, purity, self, bliss, and permanence, Gyaltsabje points out, they're valid regarding a different kind of object. What's the object of perception now? The mind of a Buddha, the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body of a Buddha, right? So he's saying with respect to the Dharma body of a Buddha, the points we were making earlier about samsara aren't valid anymore, right? Because it's not that kind of object of perception. The Dharmakaya of a Buddha is pure, right? Is bliss, is permanent, and is self in a certain sense. So we're going to go over what is that? What does he mean now? But let me pause there. Does that make sense up to that point? So that those 4 points about that, things are impermanent and so on, are valid cognitions regarding samsaric phenomena. And now Maitreya is taking those same terms and saying, yes, those are true regarding samsaric phenomena, but the Dharmakaya is not a samsaric phenomenon. Right? The Dharmakaya is a pure phenomenon. So when we say the Dharmakaya is pure, we're now that's valid actually. And I'll make one more point, then I'll pause for questions. Part of it is this, is like bliss. I'm going to use the example of bliss. We could pick any of the four, right? Silly. Oh gosh. If you're looking for bliss in the wrong place, you're not going to find it. Right? So if you're looking for bliss in that which is subject to the mental afflictions, you'll never find bliss there. But what this teaching is saying is, but bliss does exist. And you should seek bliss, but seek it in the right place. Right? Seek it by realizing the ultimate nature of your own mind, which then will transform into the Dharmakaya, and you'll have bliss. And that bliss will be permanent, actually. So it's part of the implication here is look to the right place. If you're looking for bliss, purity, self, and permanence, look for them in the right place, not the wrong place. But let me pause there and say, any questions before I go? I'm going to then describe what the teaching is saying about those four, purity and so on. But any questions? I just want to make sure it's not unclear how Maitreya is taking these terms from the first turning of the wheel and using them in a different way in this third turning of the wheel teaching. Any questions? Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. So, it reminds me of when you teach about, something that's true when you're talking about samsara versus something that's true when you're talking about the ultimate truth, right? Like conventional truth versus ultimate truth, and how things that seem contradictory aren't contradictory when you look at it that way. I guess you're going to explain it. So I'm looking forward to hearing I want to hear how you explain how the Dharmakaya is permanent. And we have pure bliss, self, and permanent. And pure and bliss, I think I got a handle on when it comes to the Dharmakaya, but permanent and self, I'm very curious about how that's explained.
They're the harder ones, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, so we'll go over, yeah, so we're still on the same point, the result, right? And so we're talking about the resultant state. What's the result? And by the way, you get it, the result. Why is it called result? The result of Buddha nature, right, of Tathagata is the Dharmakaya, right? That's the result. If you apply those four antidotes to not, like compassion and wisdom and so on, then the result of your Tathagata of your Buddha nature is that you will achieve the Dharmakaya, right? And what you achieve when you achieve the Dharmakaya will be in the nature of purity, of self, of bliss, and of permanence. So I'll do them in the same order that they're presented here. So purity first, yeah. So a number of points are made. So I'm going to go over them. So about purity. One point is purity is unique to the Dharmakaya. So it's unique to the Buddhas. It's a unique experience, uniquely of the Buddhas. And one point they make is even the Shravakas, the hearers, and the Prachika Buddhas can't imagine, the teaching says, that the Dharmakaya is unlike samsaric phenomena in this way. In other words, that it's difficult to conceive of, is one point they're making, or difficult for those who, for those not on the Mahayana to conceive of it. And so the way it's presented is quite artful, so I'm going to follow the presentation, because it's getting at those four obstacles. So it says, those with great desire, right, who have a great deal of desire, have animosity towards the Dharma, right? They have no interest in the Dharma. They think it's uninteresting. They even could feel negatively towards it. And so if you're, as long as you're stuck in that kind of animosity towards the Dharma, you say stuck in impurity by being greatly attached to what is impure, meaning suffering and its causes, right? As though they were pure, right? So in other words, you're looking, as long as you're caught in great desire, you're looking for purity within samsara, and therefore you keep grasping at different versions of samsaric suffering and the causes of suffering. Once you develop faith or devotion or conviction in the Dharma, you begin a process of the path and eventually achieve the Dharmakaya, right? And how is the Dharmakaya pure? And it points out in the text here, there are two ways in which the Dharmakaya is pure. One is we call the nature body, the Svabhavakakaya. That, in other words, the nature body of a Buddha is the emptiness of the mind of a Buddha, and that emptiness is always pure. Right? Emptiness is pure. Emptiness is a mere negation, so it has no suffering. It has no mental afflictions. It has no impurities. It's a mere negation. So it's, and even our Buddha nature was pure from the beginning, right? It was because it's an emptiness in that sense. But the Dharmakaya is pure in another sense as well, in the sense that the Dharmakaya has also had a cessation. There is that being who achieved the Dharmakaya, achieved the cessation of all the mental afflictions and their imprints and even their subtlest imprints, right? And so through, and it's actually interesting, through realizing the natural purity, what we call the first one the natural purity. Natural purity means emptiness, right? It's the nature, natural in the sense that the nature of things is their emptiness, and emptiness is pure. So the point here being made is by having realized the natural purity of the mind, meaning its empty nature, one has eventually purified all the defilements, all the mental afflictions and their imprints. And therefore, the Dharmakaya is naturally pure, but is also pure of what we call adventitious, these temporary mental afflictions, because the Buddha has purified them through realizing the nature of mind, the nature of self, emptiness. So in that sense, the Dharmakaya is pure in those ways. It's pure, it's pure in the sense that it's pure of a self-existent entity or nature, but it's also pure of, and I want to say the mental afflictions, right? So like, ignorance, craving or desire, anger, all the secondary mental afflictions. And then also, there are different meanings of their imprints also. Their imprints, in one sense of that, is that they can arise again. So the imprints meaning like the seeds of them. And then another is their subtle imprints, which are obstacles to omniscience. So the Buddha's purified all of those. So the Dharmakaya is completely pure of the mental afflictions. So when it says purity, that's what's meant. And so what we're getting at there is, ordinary beings, right, grasp for purity in the context of samsaric phenomena. The Dharmakaya is the actual purity, right, that one should aim for, in a sense. And it's the result of the path, and the result of having the Buddha nature. The result of that is the Dharmakaya, which is pure. Ryan said that was the easy one, so now we'll jump to a hard one. Self, right? So, and Gyaltsab addresses this. He said, like you could, how to say this rightly. One has to be careful when asserting that the Dharmakaya is self, right? Because, if one were to assert that it's self in the sense of like, what's the word? Like an ultimately existing self, then that would be contradictory to the Buddha's teachings on emptiness. So is that, you could say, wait, is the Buddha saying there is a soul? For, like the original teaching of the Buddha, right, was anatman. There is no, we translate, atman is often translated as soul, sometimes as self. Right, so you could be concerned here. You could say, wait a second, is the Buddha now going to assert there is some kind of eternal soul, or that the Buddha is some? And no, it's not that. So the way it's presented again is this kind of artful combination of these different teachings. So it says the Tritikas, which one translator translated as fundamentalists, kind of like that translation. But so it's like philosophers with a wrong philosophy, a wrong understanding. Such philosophers grasp at a self which never existed in the first place, right? So in other words, ordinary beings grasp at a self, and then sometimes people make up philosophies sort of promoting that self. But such a self, right, such an intrinsically existent self never did exist. Never once, in all of samsaric existence, one has grasped at such a self since beginningless time, but it never existed at all. It was always delusion. And that's the cause of suffering. Then through the wisdom that realizes emptiness, the transcendental wisdom that realizes emptiness, one overcomes this self-grasping habit, right? This ancient habit we have of grasping at a self, which was the cause of suffering, or is the cause of suffering for ordinary beings. Then the Tathagata, right, the Buddha, the one thus gone, I want to say it this way, realizes the ultimate nature of the self, right? Which is selflessness, right? They realize there is no such self, right? There is no intrinsic existent self. They realize that in a state free of all conceptual elaborations of self or no self, right? Whereas they're in a state that's beyond conceptual elaborations, that doesn't, beyond permanence and annihilation, that doesn't assert a self and also isn't nihilistic, doesn't assert there's nothing, right? And the way the text says it is having the highest self, having pacified elaborations of self and selflessness, right? So what they're saying actually is that what's being referred to here as the self is the mind that understands reality beyond grasping at self or no self. That's how it's presented in the text. I'm going to say another point about it. You know, in the Heart Sutra, it says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness, right? It's a famous part of the Heart Sutra. And what that's getting at in the Heart Sutra, right, is the nature of form is emptiness, right? And emptiness manifests as form, right? That's what's being gotten at there. This is similar, right? So the ultimate nature of the self is emptiness. And emptiness manifests as the merely labeled self, for example, of the Buddha, right? And that is the nature of self, right? So if you're searching, actually, it's interesting, in samsara, one grasps at an independently existent or inherently existent self, and one suffers. Here, what's being gotten as the Buddha is beyond such grasping. And in a sense, you could say the Buddha understands the ultimate nature of the self, right? So that's the nature. You could say that's the nature of the self, right? So the Dharmakaya understands the nature of the self, which is that there is no intrinsically existent self. Anyway, so when it says the result, the Dharmakaya is the self, what it's being gotten is that what kind of self is it? It's a self that has pacified all elaborations of self or selflessness. And that kind of wisdom is the utter cure for self-grasping. Then bliss. So this one centers on, right, the example of hearers, but many beings, right, are actually, they use the example of hearers, right, of Shravakas, people who are just seeking their own liberation because they're so afraid of samsaric suffering, right? But actually, we can all relate to that. There are times where suffering seems so daunting, so overwhelming, so frightening that one wants to escape it, right? And wants to kind of not engage. And what there's a from a Buddhist perspective, I mean, actually, it's an interesting point here, right? And one way on the path, I just want to, from a practical perspective, I want to make a comment here. On the one hand, there's a problem, which is that's dualistic, isn't it? In other words, ultimately, we say samsara, the nature of samsara and the nature of nirvana are the same, right? They're emptiness. We call in the Sakya tradition, they call it the non-differentiation of samsara and nirvana, meaning their ultimate nature, the ultimate nature of both is emptiness, right? And because the Buddha realizes that, the Buddha can engage infinitely with others compassionately. But also, I think this is my own reflection now for a moment. On the path, one needs to know, it says samadhi, concentration, meditation, meditative concentration is the antidote to that kind of fear, right? I just want to say on a practical level, I think something is implied here, and this is my own opinion now, which is ultimately, the goal, right, is to infinitely engage with others, with love and with compassion. But that the antidote to that fear is samadhi, is concentration, implies that when you're on the path, you need to know when to retreat, when to pause and go meditate, right? So it's quite practical instruction, isn't it? That we need to have that inner resource, that inner place to go to in order to then re-engage with others, and that there's a dialectic there. But one needs, the teaching is saying one needs concentration, that bodhisattvas need concentration. You know, and actually there are many, I often think of that. There are many stories like in Tibet of, one of my heroes is the first Panchen Lama, who was the teacher of the fourth and fifth Dalai Lamas. And there are these beautiful stories of him, though, where sometimes there were a lot of like wars during his life between the Mongolian, the Mongolian Empire was quite powerful at that time, and they were sometimes having incursions into Tibet, and there were battles between certain Tibetan kings and the Mongolian armies. And if you look at the biography of the first Panchen Lama, it's quite beautiful in the sense that there were times where there was like a battle. He was a very famous Lama and very powerful person, a very respected person. And there are times where there was about to be a battle, and he would go towards the battle, and he would like negotiate. He would go ask the leaders of the Mongolian and the Tibetan king to come talk, and he would kind of do peace negotiation and help bring about peace. There are other times when there was a war starting, and he would go off to the mountains and do a retreat and stay in a cave somewhere or a hermitage. And I was like, oh, he's quite wise. You know, he knew the timing. He knew when to engage compassionately and when to go off and practice samadhi, so that when the time was right, he could again help. You know, he wasn't running towards the battle where he was going to get shot or whatever, killed, because nobody would listen. So he somehow had a wisdom of knowing when to engage and when to retreat, which is wise. Anyway, I think in his case, it was literally in the context of battles, but I think we all have that we all need that, our own version of that kind of wisdom is a side point I'm making. But then the way it's actually presented in the text is this, regarding bliss, is it uses the example of hearers, right? But it says they fear samsaric engagement. They fear engaging within samsara. They fear remaining within samsara. Whereas this kind of transcendental supreme bliss remains concerned and engaged with others. The Dharmakaya is beyond the gross aggregate, and this is an important point here. It's beyond the gross aggregates of samsara. So actually, I'm pausing because I'm realizing I could read what it says, but some won't be clear what it means. What's being gotten at here is this: first of all, the nature of the Dharmakaya is blissful. That's one point. Another point is it's getting at different distinctions here, which we'll explain. Our body and mind are conditioned by mental afflictions and karma. Like, so if from a Buddhist perspective, the 12 links, right? If you study the 12 links of dependent arising, where do our body and mind come from? They come from in a past life when we were dying, we grasp at a self, you know, in which people do. Right? As we're dying, we're afraid, and we think, I want to keep existing because we grasp at a self, at an intrinsically existent self. And then we have various mental afflictions. They give rise, and they activate our karma, and they throw us into another lifetime without our control, which is part of the nature of samsaric suffering, is that we don't have control over the process of death and rebirth, where we're out of control in that sense. And so our aggregates, right, our 5 aggregates, or you could say our body and mind, are conditioned by our past karma and by our mental afflictions. And therefore we're samsaric beings in the nature of samsaric suffering, you know, right now. Then this teaching is explaining about bliss. It's saying, hearers and solitary realizers who are arhats, right? Those who have achieved arhatship, who have achieved a kind of liberation. They have a kind of subtle body, actually, and a subtle mind, right? That are a result of pure karma and wisdom, but are still, what's the word? that are still conditioned by the imprints of ignorance. So dualistic, in other words. They still have a dualistic kind of existence because they haven't, what's the word? Because they haven't removed the subtle imprints of the mental afflictions. And then Arya Bodhisattvas, who have seen emptiness directly, they have a kind of mental body, it says. And that mental body is a result of their pure karma and their compassionate prayers. It's still dualistic. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful achievement. So the bodhisattvas who have seen emptiness directly aren't any longer thrown after they die by their karma and mental afflictions. They take rebirth through their aspirations to help others, essentially. And then pure karmic connections they have of prayer for others and so on. So they take rebirth as somebody's child and they go teach and they keep practicing the path. These are different levels of realization that one can go through, that one does go through on the path, that are quite marvelous, actually, right? And what this is getting at, this teaching here on bliss, is saying those are quite good, but those are all still, whether you have these gross aggregates that are samsaric, or you have the mental body of an Arya Bodhisattva that's still dualistic, and that's not, how did Khensa Rinpoche once put it? They're within samsara, but they're not samsaric beings. They're not samsaric beings in the sense they're not thrown by karma and mental afflictions, but they're still within samsara. They still have mental afflictions. They're still controlled by, they're still not, they're not so much controlled by it, but they're still, they're still controlled by their dualistic. They can't be free of dualism. And then even the arhats themselves still haven't removed the subtle imprints, so they still have a tendency towards dualism. And what this is getting at is the Dharmakaya is beyond all of that. There's no dualistic perceptions left. So it's beyond the subtle aggregates of Arya Bodhisattvas. It's beyond all dualism, and is a supreme bliss beyond birth and death. It's an omniscience beyond any kind of fear. And one who's beyond all dualistic perceptions is completely beyond all fear. And one commentary said they've removed all the obstacles to omniscience, which are the subtle latencies that conceptualize things as though they were truly existent. Or the subtle latencies that give rise to dualistic perceptions of inherently existent objects, even on the level of sensory perception. So in other words, even Arya Bodhisattvas, when they see or hear things, their senses still, out of past imprints, have an imprint of dualism. Buddhas don't have that. Or seeing the conventional truth and the ultimate truth as separate entities. Buddhas don't do that either. So they're the point being made here is they're completely beyond all dualism. This is a result of the concentration of the particularly it's called the space treasure concentration of the Arya Bodhisattvas. So the Arya Bodhisattvas have this kind of concentration through which they eventually overcome all dualism. And therefore, they can, while in the experience of utter bliss, can engage with others limitlessly. It's a unique quality of the Buddhas. And so when we say bliss, that's what we mean here, is that as a result of such concentration, they've overcome all fear, all dualism, all tendencies to give rise to a body that's born of any dualism. And so they can manifest anywhere limitlessly to benefit others, while internally, while in their own experience, let's put it that way, sustaining a state of blissful wisdom, understanding the ultimate nature of truth, the nature of ultimate truth. And that's the nature of the Dharmakaya. Right, so we're understanding what's the nature of the result. That's the nature of the result. And I'll cover the last point, and then I'll pause for questions, because this might be confusing, I'm not sure, but the last point here is permanence. That was the last of the four. And so the sense of permanence here has a few different connotations. The actual text says, it is the perfection of permanence as it realizes samsara and nirvana to be equal in nature. That was what I mentioned earlier, right? I said the non-differentiation of samsara and nirvana. So one point is they realize, that from, say it right? They realize that all things are equal in being empty, right? And they realize that it's actually interesting, isn't it? They realize that the ultimate nature, even of the suffering of samsaric beings, is natural purity, meaning emptiness. While they also understand that ordinary beings, that samsaric beings, suffer, right? Conventional, on the level of conventional truth, and they don't see those as separate entities. And that allows them to do something, right? Which is, I'll read it here. The transcendence of permanence means, I'll just say it this way, means that Buddhas can work without interruption for as long as samsara exists. And this is, so part of the point here is, on the path, the Bodhisattva meditated on compassion over and over. It made vows of compassion, it made aspirations of compassion. And the result of that activity on the path that bodhisattvas do is that at the time of the result, the Buddhas, what's the word? Can work limitlessly until the end of samsara, right? So permanently in that sense, for the welfare of beings. And the Dharmakaya doesn't, it doesn't stop. It doesn't, it doesn't stop working for the welfare of beings. It doesn't end. And another point that's made, I just want to make sure another point that's being made here is that the Dharmakaya is a final cessation, right, of suffering and its causes, beyond the views of eternalism or nihilism. And in that sense, also, you could say, so actually there are two connotations here, I think. The main one is, due to compassion, the Buddha's Dharmakaya emanates endlessly, permanently, for the welfare of others. Another is, that's I think an implication, is that, the phenomena, what's the word? Emptiness is permanent. Emptiness is not changing instant by instant. And so in that sense, also the Dharmakaya, the Svabhavika Dharmakaya, the nature body of a Buddha, is permanent in the sense that it's not changing instant by instant. I think that's also an implication there. So stepping back again, though, so you get the overall point here. This is a big topic in the text we're going to come back to, but so in samsara, with regards to samsaric phenomena, again, if you grasp for permanence in impermanent phenomena, you'll suffer. If you grasp for bliss in that which is the cause of suffering, you'll suffer, and so on. If you grasp at a self where there's no self, you'll suffer. Here, we're talking about a different object, which is the Buddha's truth body, the Dharma. And what it's saying is, one doesn't grasp there, and the Buddhas don't grasp, but there one does find purity, right? There one does find permanence. There one does find bliss, and there one does find the ultimate nature of the self. So that's what's being described, I think. I'll pause. Any questions? Robin had her hand up first.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate this. This is really wonderful. I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification in terms of the cessation element of Dharmakaya. You're speaking of a wisdom body versus a natural body, nature body. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure I was keeping up.
Actually, I'll say a quick comment about that, though, because there actually, when you think of cessation, right? That term that you mentioned, like, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, sometimes it's talked about in certain tenet systems, cessation, we talk about cessation as, well, in general in Buddhism, part of the quality of cessation, right, is that there are mental afflictions, and then when they, there's a difference, right? Sometimes they can be suppressed, like through concentration, one can suppress the mental afflictions. But that's not cessation, right? Cessation comes through realization of emptiness, and then someone eliminates the cause of that mental affliction, and it won't arise again. It can't arise again because the cause of it has been eliminated. Sometimes we talk about cessation just as that, right? As you've eliminated through wisdom, realizing emptiness, you've eliminated the cause of that mental affliction, therefore that mental affliction can't arise again. In the Dharmakaya state, all of them have been eliminated. One point, just a subtle distinction in case it's of use to people, is particularly in this consequentialist middle way school, the Prasangika Madhyamaka school of Chandrakirti. The Chandrakirti explicates effectively, very particularly well. He actually makes the point. He says, when he uses the term cessation, he's kind of getting at there's that state where one has eliminated the seeds and the causes of a mental affliction, so one has sort of achieved the cessation. But he says actually cessation is the emptiness of that mind. So he kind of says it's the mind that is, there's a mind of a being like a Buddha, let's say, who's achieved through wisdom, has achieved the cessation of all the mental afflictions and their imprints. And then he says, philosophically, he says the ultimate meaning of cessation in that context, though, is the emptiness of that mind. So then that would be the nature body, technically, in that sense, in the way Chandrakirti uses it. But if you were talking about it from other tenet systems, even the other Madhyamakas, the non-Prasangika Madhyamakas, then they wouldn't say it that way. They would say it's just the elimination of the causes. So it depends which tenet system you're talking about it from. But technically, I think Chandrakirti's stance would be it's the emptiness of that mind. So then in his view, it would be the nature body. Whereas if you were talking about it from the perspective of, say, Baba Viveka, who taught the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, then you would say, no, it's just the cessation of, the elimination of the causes of the mental afflictions in that continuum. Oh, I can.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that element of it, but if you look at the 16 aspects, if you go to the truth of cessation, I guess it sort of provides clues.
Yeah.
But in that sense, but so now is that to say that the 16 aspects are not prasangika? There's svatantika, madhyamaka?
No, actually, if you think about the 16 aspects, they're presented as true according to all the different tenet systems, like so even the Vaibhashikas would teach them the Satantrika, the Satantrikas, but they each have their own interpretation. So in other words, a Prasangika Madhyamaka would have their own interpretation of the word, so they would accept the 16 aspects, but each tenet system would explain them. Many of them they would overlap, but they actually have slight differences in how they would understand the meaning of them. So for example, like when we say there's one where it says self and empty, right? Like a lower tenet system would say empty means empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, whereas a Prasangika would say empty means empty of an inherently existent self. So they would take that word shunya, empty, but they would interpret it differently. So like, a mind only follower, for example, would say that means empty of, they might say empty of subject and object existing as separate independent entities, whereas a Prasangika would say it means empty of intrinsic existence. So they would take the same term, but they would interpret differently. So they would all accept the 16 aspects, but they interpret them slightly different.
Thank you. I've been wondering for a really long time how this third aspect of purity, how misconceiving impure is pure as being empty, because that's how, really generalized description of it is. And it's like, how does that work in terms of impure as pure being empty? But now I get it. Thank you so much.
That's great. Yeah, any other comments or questions? Oh, Lynn, yeah.
You're saying that sometimes it's the best move to retreat. I thought was very helpful because lots of times I get into, well, I don't know lots of times, but there was a situation yesterday where I got into a situation where someone was grasping at something. We had to get a brief out and the internet was down in our area downtown. And so I'm talking to a lawyer, explaining to her how to send something by Federal Express. And it was an unreasonable requirement, but we had to do it, right? We had a big brief, lots of exhibits, right? And I just said, why don't we have someone in the office do it? And she said, well, this is not in my job description. And my first impetus was, you don't have a job description. And I thought, that's not going to be helpful. So we went through it a little bit, and she doesn't have a job description. She's a junior lawyer in a public interest law firm, right? So she doesn't have a job description. And I can't tell you how many times I've been at FedEx late at night. Okay, so I said, so finally I realized I'm not going to get her to think the way I'm thinking, which is just get this brief out the easiest way possible. So I said, okay, you deal with it. You seem to have a good handle on it. You deal with it. And then I went to lunch. But that's sort of a situation where I sort of thought I could have argued with her, but she was grasping at this image of who she was as a lawyer, and it doesn't work. I mean, it just doesn't work. So I said, okay, yeah, you've got a good grasp on it. You wrote a great brief. So, okay, you deal with it the way you want to. And of course it got out and it was fine. But I get in these situations, if I'm concentrated enough, I can say, okay, retreat and get out, but I can't always do that. So I guess this practice is getting to that state more often, where you can get out of the situations where you're not drawn into grasping. I mean, that's the way I see it. Maybe I'm seeing this wrong.
Yeah. I think it's hard, isn't it? Like, to have, I mean, in general, in the teaching, right, they're saying bodhisattvas need samadhi, need concentration. But I think it takes a lot of wisdom, and I actually, and I guess my own observation for myself, and with also with like Dharma friends, including like, people who are monks and nuns or whatever, like, is partly it comes about, I think, for beginners, like, I mean, they're talking about as bodhisattvas in this text to some extent, but my own experience is that it comes about partly through making mistakes and learning from them. Like, doesn't it? Like, oh wow, like, I didn't discern when to do that, and it didn't, and then it went wrong, so I don't do it differently. Because it's hard to know, and they actually say that, don't they? That in the teachings, that the higher one goes, the higher one's progress along the path, or the more one's progress on the path, the easier it becomes to know the right thing to do at the right time. And only a Buddha knows, actually they say that, like, only a Buddha is completely unmistaken, so they don't need to, they do it spontaneously and naturally. But that for the rest of us, we get better at it the further along the path we go and the more wisdom we develop. But I don't think it's easy, actually, is my own view anyway, for what it's worth, like, to know when, that's why I was so impressed with the example of the Panchen Lama. He would literally go off and do like a meditation retreat and then come back, and then he would know, but I think it's hard to know when, when do you keep engaging. But I think one key point I'll make, just for my own, whatever, this isn't in the text, but just is, the Buddhist, like, the Buddhist emphasis is internal. So in other words, to judge, like, if oneself is getting an increase in mental afflictions, then it's time to pull back, right? Because actually that's the Buddhist perspective, isn't it? Is good things don't come from mental afflictions. So if a certain context is giving rise to more mental afflictions, then it's better to pull back, whereas if one's compassion and love are increasing, then it's better to go forward, is a really interesting point. And that that's not the view in other, in the culture, in other contexts that I hear, is like, but it's making me remember, actually, there's one, as I said that, I thought I'm wrong, actually. I was thinking of one other context where it's actually Jan Willis, a teacher of mine, but where she was talking about that, right, when she was marching with Dr. King. I think it was this week, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. day, but she was a child marching, and she said like that if somebody, some of the other kids who were angry, then the leaders of the march would say, you can't come today. Go meditate, you know, go pray, I guess, and we'll see about tomorrow. Which was kind of the same wisdom, is my point. Like, there needs to be love or it's not going to work. So I was wrong when I said only, you know, like it's not, there are various contexts where but that's the wisdom, right? Is like, if there's not love there, if there's, you know, if there's not love or compassion there, it's not the right action. I think that's a guideline that the Buddhism would assert, that in that case, she was also saying was asserted. So I guess there are various contexts, but it's an internal measure, I guess, is my point. Which I think is what's being gotten in the text, though, when they talk about bodhisattvas. I love that metaphor. So let's go back. I said it earlier, right? Where they said, like, in one point in the text, in the commentary, it said the bodhisattvas need the womb of samadhi to develop, you know, meaning they need this kind of safe context of their own inner concentration so that they don't get overwhelmed, right, by whatever's going on. So we all have to take responsibility, I guess, to be honest with ourselves. When I guess it's hard. I find it hard, but part of why I find it hard, I think sometimes, is that I don't use that measure. You know, I think, oh, but somebody expects this, or somebody wants me to do this, or somebody, rather than what's actually going on. Am I actually being compassionate or not? And follow that. I think anyway, I think it's a mistake I make. So I'm just being honest. That's my flaws. Oh, we went past the time though. So I guess we need to stop, and we'll do the dedication in a sec. I just want to say, in case there are a few people who might want to do that. So we'll take this class will end in a minute. For those who are interested, we're going to at 12:45 on a different Zoom link that's on the website. I think, Gabe, right? Should be on the website. We're going to do, for those who are interested, we're going to do the Lama Chopa. Because today is also Chakra Samvara Day. So for those who have, you don't have to have that initiation or anything, but those who feel like doing, it's also a Tsog Day in the Tibetan tradition. So a separate Zoom link at 1:45. Those who feel like coming are welcome. Anybody who doesn't, it just doesn't matter, but people are welcome. But that'll be a different link. So, and then we have other classes already scheduled for next month, I guess it is. Yes, it'll be in February. There are already classes scheduled. So let's just do the dedication. So the supreme jewel of bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. And where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. We dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And finally, may all of us have success, through this merit, may we all have success in realizing, in overcoming the obstacles, the 4 obstacles to realizing our Buddha nature, and fully actualizing it, and thereby may we all be able to give rise to experience the 4 qualities of the Dharmakaya, right? So bliss, permanence, purity, and self, that are the ultimate versions of those, the Dharmakaya, which are aspects of the Dharmakaya. Well, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Lauren.
Thank you,
Oh, thanks.
everyone.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oh, thank you.